One, do we need for input? Five, okay.
Brian, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
You're welcome.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. It's 9 o'clock. Thanks for attending our every other month Funders Council. We'll start with introductions, and we'll introduce everybody in the room first, and then we'll go to those folks that are on Zoom. We'll start with Arrow, if that's all right. Come around this way.
Arrow Woodard, City of Largo Housing Division.
Jennifer Tiaga, Juvenile Welfare Board.
Lizzie St. Pierre, City of Pinellas Park.
Wonderful. Doug and Cooley, Pinellas Community Foundation.
Teresa Jones, City of St. Petersburg.
Amy Foster, HLA.
Haley Saganowski, HLA.
Avery Slaker, HLA.
Chuck Lang, City of Thor.
All right. And for everyone online, if you just quickly introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Karen Yatchum, Human Services, Pinellas County.
Good morning, Brian Leapley, HLA.
Good morning, Joshua Johnson, City of St. Petersburg, Housing and Community Development.
And we have Gabe from Clearwater joining us, Joe from Pinellas County,
They're joining.
and Yvonne from the VA.
Great. All right, we'll go ahead and get started into our agenda this morning. The first item on the agenda is the consent agenda, and I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Wait a second.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Teresa and second by Arrow. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Same sign. All right, we'll go ahead and jump right into Brian and the data dashboard review, please.
Okay. Oh, I am not able to share my screen on this. I know it is in the agenda, starting on page 4.
Brian, we're gonna make you a co-host so you can share your screen.
Perfect, thank you. There we go, okay. All right, so this is the dashboard that runs from the current date range from October 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021, and then the previous quarter from July 1st through September 30th, 2021. So this is not on the website yet. It will be posted within the next few days once we hit the beginning of March, or February. Some of the basic notes that I want to pull out from this as we go through. So the first one is that at the top of the first page of the dashboard, it does give us the overall count of people being served in the current quarter and the change from the previous quarter. We had been seeing this down in the high 4,000, low 5,000 range earlier in the pandemic. For the last several quarters, we are seeing this hovering around the very low 6,000 range. So right now we have 6,162 that were served in the previous quarter, and that is a slight decrease from the quarter before of a decrease of 252. This is looking like this might be the kind of the new normal as far as our data goes quarter over quarter, because we have to go back to the first quarter of 2021, so a year ago, to see this being significantly different, and that was down at 5,300. So it looks like this might be kind of the new status quo for our data. So it's one thing I wanted to point out. For the demographics, we don't generally see a lot of shift from quarter to quarter. Most of this is holding pretty steady. The one thing I do want to point out from the race demographics are, if we look at it by filtering it by household type, the one thing that we do see is that when you look at families with minor children, the percentage of Black and African Americans that make up that that demographic within our community is about 65%. As a COC, we're about 40% of those served are Black and African American. So families are disproportionately Black and African American, even more so than our general population as a whole compared to Pinellas County. So it's the one thing from the demographics I want to point out. The other thing kind of that ties in with that, especially because we have a lot of funding that targets families with minor children, is if we look at rapid rehousing and prevention, they're very similar. We see the same kind of disproportionate representation there as well. So again, we have a lot of rapid rehousing and prevention projects that serve families with minor children. So in that demographic breakdown, we see a similar thing where with both, right now this is rapid rehousing, it's 58% in the current quarter were Black and African American compared to 33% white. When we look at prevention, it also follows basically the exact same breakdown, 57% Black and African American compared to 33% white. Part of this is our targeted prevention. It's also, again, based on the household types that a lot of those projects are serving. But it's just the one major thing that we have seen while reviewing this data internally that I just wanted to bring out, because otherwise a lot of our demographic data isn't that significant one way or another. That's one of the major things that we see that really is very different from the overall demographics for the COC. So I will move over to length of enrollment. Again, demographics, we don't see a lot of shift quarter to quarter. With length of enrollment, there isn't a lot. When we look at the system level that's changing, we're seeing a very slight increase in length of stay for emergency shelter. Last quarter, we were at 62 days average. Now we're at 73 days average. It's a minor shift, again, on the surface, but when we really dig down into it, what we're seeing is, again, it follows into some of those same, the same subpopulation breakdowns. When we really split that out by households with minor children compared to adults, we see those numbers diverge pretty significantly. So if I pull up the households with minor children to show what that looks like for emergency shelter, our current quarter average is 132 days. Individuals or like adult only households, might be a couple or partners together, their average is 53 days. So we're seeing some pretty significant differences there based on those population types being served. And I think the households with minor children issue is something that we're seeing just system-wide as well, with rapid rehousing taking longer to place people into housing that had pre-pandemic. We're seeing some of that data kind of trickle down and impact some of the other projects in our system. And so we're seeing that increase in length of stay in shelter really around families. Our individuals, again, they haven't shifted too much and they're really around the system average. But for families, we are seeing an increase. Last quarter for families, we were at 98 days. So again, we're seeing about a 30-day increase overall. And this is something that we see across the different family shelters, and it's not necessarily just a single family shelter that's causing this to increase. We're seeing some shifts, but we are seeing just general, some of that is taking longer to move people through the system. With days to housing as the next one. Yes.
We have a question.
Oh yeah, sure.
I see transitional, can you go back to the last slide that you had up there, Brian? And
Yes.
the transitional housing is, what qualifies transitional housing?
So for families, the only, so we have a couple that fall under that. For families, it could be Alpha House, but they can fall into a couple pools because depending on the age breakdown for the families that are being served, you know, the parents with newborns. The main driver of our transitional housing data for households with minor children is Salvation Army's Hope Crest facility in Clearwater. Is a 14-unit family transitional housing project. And they are really the only family transitional housing project that we have that's entering data into HMIS. The rest of our transitional housing projects are like St. Pete Free Clinics, men's and women's residents, some of the GPD, the VA GPD programs also are classified as transitional housing. HEP has a transitional housing program for adults only. So a lot of the transitional housing beds that we have in the community are for individuals. Hope Crest is really the only one that we have data from for HMIS that is serving adults or families with minor children. So that's where that data is coming from. So it's a smaller pool. It's about 40 or so beds, give or take. So in the current quarter, it was 43 people served. Previous quarter, it was 45. So they've been running mostly at capacity. So that's where we're seeing that that data coming from for transitional with children.
Right, I think you were trying to show us the number of people when you were scanning over there. We can't, okay, thank you. We can see.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a question just to clarify if you mentioned there? So we only have one transitional housing facility. It's Oak Crest in Clearwater that serves, it has 14 units, 4 families. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the average length of stay for families is like 120 days.
So it's right now it's 522 days for the current quarter, 481 for the previous quarter.
In
So-
emergency insurance, the 132.
Yeah, emergency shelter is 132.
Brian, let me explain something to Kathleen since she's newer and she's trying to put all this together. So there's some history around transitional housing. HUD shifted their focus from transitional housing a couple of years ago. And, you know, rapid rehousing is to replace that in many ways. It's only allowable for people who are tenuously sober or DV. So that's why you don't see a lot of that in our system. But it doesn't mean we can't have transitional housing as a community, right? There's a need, but these projects that enter are funded by HUD, for example. And there are other transitional housing projects in our community that serve families, but they don't enter into HMIS. So we're missing all their data. So I just wanted to give you some context there.
And I have another question. It's related to rapid housing. As I see it, it's showing that the average is less than a year. And it slightly was about the same for African Americans, if I'm reading this correctly, as to other groups. And so my question is that a good thing that we're seeing? Well, no, it's not. My question is that when they graduate from the financial assistance, case management, and all those kinds of things? I'm just trying to figure out what those number of days equates to. Is that when they're closed out by their provider, which means that they quote unquote graduated and no longer receiving case management and financial assistance?
Yeah, so so Teresa, you're right. This is pulling from that data. So this is from when they're connected to that project and enrolled in that rapid rehousing project through the date of discharge from that program, whenever those services have ended. So it is an interesting question, like what do we want to see with this data? I'm not sure it's something that anyone has a great grasp on, even nationwide, because obviously discharging someone from a program early just to keep that number down doesn't necessarily equate to success, whereas keeping them for an extra month could, equate to success. So it is challenging with this one. I think the next metric we have is how long it takes to get them housed, provides a little more detail on that. Because this is showing, from that point of enrollment, what's that average day to housing. And so right now it's 76 days. So if we're looking at a 210-day average enrollment, 76 days, let's say 3 months to housing, they're in the program for 7 months total. That means that on average, we're seeing about 4 months of services for people enrolled in rapid rehousing. And so then it brings up the question of, is that enough? Is that too much? How does that play out? where is that success lying? Because we have some programs that are very different depending on the funding stream, how long they can provide that assistance. So I think this is a little bit of what you're looking for as far as understanding the two of them together, understanding what does that mean for rapid rehousing, because you're right that it is different than shelter, where that length of stay is how long are they there receiving other assistance, whatever case management they may be getting in shelter, transitional housing. With this one, it's more complex because it is, they're looking for housing, then they get housed, then they're getting assistance after that point until they're done with the program.
So some context here that I'm seeing and processing while you see this, we talk a lot and funders are concerned about the housing market and are we able to move people into housing? And we were seeing those numbers go up and up and up over previous quarters. And now we're seeing that go down. There's probably a couple of things happening here. If I look at the previous period, that was July to September, and the moratorium was still in effect. So there were no units to move people to. The moratorium is no longer in effect, and so that has probably opened some units to move people to. We'll have to see what that looks like quarter over quarter. I don't draw that conclusion yet. Because the other thing I can just tell you from my own context of looking at our housing rate internally at HLA is there seems to be, this swing where a couple months you can't get people housed, can't get people housed, whole bunch of people housed, can't get people housed, and so it's just a part of the market of units opening up over time and certain types of units. So we've seen a couple months ago, I know the landlord liaison said they couldn't find any 1 bedrooms, or no, they could only find 1 bedrooms and they needed 2 and 3 bedrooms. And right now they're able to find a whole bunch of 1 bedrooms and not the other. So we're gonna have to watch this over time. I don't want to draw conclusions yet, but I wanted to point that out.
But that would make me question also, are we seeing increases in people that are coming through diversion and.
We are.
I think there's some seasonality with it too, potentially, or to look for that with people from up north coming down. So I don't know how that.
And then my other question was and so do we also, I'm sure you guys have this, but the time people are on the list before they're getting picked up?
That is something that Data System Performance added as a benchmark to what we're going to be monitoring for the next 6 months to then have baseline data so we can create something. We did remove the length of stay benchmark because we were saying the same thing. Why are we measuring that for rapid rehousing when you have so many programs out there with different lengths of stay? That isn't something that we really need to be benchmarking, but we do need to be benchmarking what is the connection from the time that they are referred to the time that they are picked up to the time that they are housed. And so that's what we're going to be looking for.
Brian, doesn't the new report for the county show that? I just opened it up to look at it because I believe that's something that the county asked to see.
I'm trying to remember. I do have a report that does look at we look at it with internal data review monthly. That started to look at from that point of referral from the coordinated entry list to that point of enrollment. And so we really started to, as we're refining those processes, we're really looking at how can we benchmark and track coordinated entry beyond just how many people are referred, how many people are housed, because we do need to start looking at what does that mean? How is it flowing? So we have started looking at some of that. I can't remember if it's in the county report, but I do have data that pulls it.
Share that view after you're done with this particular report.
But at least this that we're looking at right now tells you from the point of program enrollment till they find, till someone is permanently housed. This information. So it still shows you that even once you're enrolled in a rapid rehousing program, it takes time to get folks into permanent housing.
Yeah, and I think I was asking in terms of just better informing too our expectations of those emergency shelter providers, right? So if someone's in shelter and it's taking them 2 days to get referred, or it's taking them 3 months, right? That's adding to this, like, what kind of expectations?
Well, yeah, I mean, in emergency shelter, it happened to write down that last quarter, it was 98 days for families, and now it's 132, which means our shelter providers that want to move people in 30 or 60 days, it's just not possible. So that's an important indicator as well.
Right, and then our expectations of them, and how many people they're supposed to serve in the course of the year is impacted. We want to be realistic.
Right.
And it also contributes in terms of the numbers that are sitting in hotels.
Absolutely.
All right, Brian, go ahead.
Yep. Sure. Well, and the one thing I wanted to add to that discussion that is something that I've started looking at with some other data is the one key about this metric is that this is only capturing the data on those that have been housed. Because the one thing that comes up, let's say with our veterans data, when we're looking at very small pools that are getting housed month to month, is that when you have people that are getting housed who have a very long period of time from either enrollment to housing or from referral to housing, whatever that might be, that can really skew the data and cause it to shift. And so the one thing this doesn't capture, because it's only looking at those that have been housed, is do we have a pool of people out there that are still waiting on that housing? And so if that's the case, that can also be driving some of that. This is looking at those that have been housed but maybe missing pools that are not part of that, where we have people that are sitting in shelter looking for that unit and are having difficulties finding the right thing for them. So there are some definitely some things to be careful about with this set of data, just because it can fluctuate. On a system level, we're talking about a fair amount of people getting housed quarterly, so we don't see huge jumps. But when we look at like a single project or a group of projects, we can see that change if we're seeing small numbers getting housed during a quarter. So this can fluctuate a fair amount quarter over quarter. But the major thing from this is, like Amy had mentioned, is that we are at 76 days. It's really the first time in a while during the pandemic that we've seen this fall under the 90-day benchmark, which is kind of the national target benchmark for this measure of days to housing. So that is a good thing. We can see this shift a little bit with some back data entry, but overall that is a good sign. It is quicker still to get some families housed. The average for families in the current quarter is 67 days. For adult-only households, it's 87 days. So there are some challenges there. I will say both of those are still significantly lower than they had been before in previous quarters, so that's good. So we are seeing those numbers come down across the board. But again, this can fluctuate some if we see some jumps. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on, especially because it does also show what some of that slowdown might be in shelter. So the number coming down is great, but again, it is a little different between the different populations. And again, we can see that also increase the next quarter pretty easily. So when you look at exits to permanent housing, again, when you look at the system-wide, there aren't significant shifts in this. The big thing that I want to point out, though, is that when we look at household types, again, that's where we're seeing some of the biggest differences. And generally what those differences are is that when we look at households with minor children, they are having a higher rate of exit to permanent housing than the adult-only households. One of the best examples here is emergency shelter. So in the current quarter, it was a 40% exit to permanent housing rate for families with minor children. For adults, it is 5%. There are some reasons for that. Safe Harbor is a big part of that, just because it is by far the largest single project just by volume in the community. It's not something that they are doing. It's just on a given year, I think they serve about 6,000 people. And we usually see about 9,000 across these projects. So they are a vast, vast part of this. And so their data just has a heavy impact on this. Whereas when we look at some of our family shelters, they are programs that try to keep people for a little longer. They have kind of a set plan. They have, case management that matches that capacity. And so we see a slightly higher exit rate. This is also probably tied to rapid rehousing. Families are connected to rapid rehousing, exit from shelter, to a rental with that rapid rehousing assistance. So there are a number of factors that come into play. But again, we are seeing a pretty high success rate for shelter for families. And when we look at other projects too, like transitional housing, again, we're really looking at that one project, but they are still having, even though they have families there for a while, they're about 75% exits to permanent housing. When we compare that to the adult-only populations, transitional housing is only about 33%, and again, shelter is 5%. So there are some pretty significant differences between the populations within the exits to permanent housing. And again, some of that comes to the resources they can be connected with and those other forms of assistance. So again, we're seeing some pretty significant differences between the two.
I have a question. How does homeless prevention weigh into exit to permanent housing if they're prevented from becoming homeless?
What Brian measures for is that they remain homeless.
Or remain housed.
That they remain.
Right. So just like with any of the other projects, they're enrolled in the prevention project, and then they have that exit destination. And so that exit destination is really just where they're going to be staying that night. So for that, we're looking for they're exiting to a rental, exiting to something they own, whatever that housing is. So it falls in line with how the others are measured. It is a little different as far as the kind of the operation, like the real world aspect of it. But as far as the data goes for HMIS, it's essentially tracked the same way. So that is a great question because it is different. They're not exiting from homelessness. They are exiting to a housing destination, but that's where they were, or they're able to get quickly rehoused. So right, it is the real world aspect is different. The data side is essentially tracked the same. So for income, there aren't a lot of differences here. We are seeing when we look at like employment income, which is this middle graph, and I know this one has a lot here because there's a lot to this one. We're not seeing a lot of shifts for increasing income. Increasing income are the bar charts. The marks are maintaining that level of income. We're not seeing a lot of shift here. The biggest thing I would say for income is that when we look at rapid rehousing, we do see a decrease of 3% from the previous quarter of the households that are increasing income, going from 16% to 13%. However, we do see an increase in those that are maintaining that income from 14% to 19%. So it's not all necessarily a bad thing. And I would say the one thing that is tricky with income is some providers don't have the case management capacity for like shelter to really assist with increasing income. But the other thing is that even if someone has income, this isn't necessarily looking at the amount. So that's the one key part too. We may have people that do have some level of income, whether it's employment or other, but it may be a very small amount to where it's not obviously going to be enough to keep them, housed or help them get some stability. So this metric is great for some things, but obviously there are some things that it doesn't explicitly show. So it's something to keep in mind when we're looking at this. That doesn't necessarily mean that people increasing income, have a significant increase. It could be a $15, $20 cost of living adjustment or something like that too. So it could be a small increase, but it would still count.
So I want to add, I don't know if it's a question or an observation here. If you want to scroll down, Brian, in the performance benchmarks for emergency shelter, we removed the benchmark that people obtain income. We measure providers on that because that's not the purpose of emergency shelter. However, I kind of had an aha yesterday. We know that there can be and should be in many ways an inverse relationship between employment income and unearned income, right? Because you can't get unearned income once you have employment income. But many of our shelter providers are funded through ESG. And many of our funders in their ESG written standards, Joe, I know I just read yours yesterday, talk about a requirement of that provider to connect people to services like benefits. And so in my opinion, we should see this much higher by any ESG funded provider, if that's in your written standards as a funder. And I think, from memory, most of you have something around that. I know it's in ours from DCF as well. And so that may be a metric that as funders for emergency shelter providers that should be looked at, since we decided it's not about income, right? That's not the purpose, but we do need to get them stabilized and connected to the supports that are available to them. And so that may be something to look at in the future, just something I'm kind of wrestling with. And it is something that HUD measures us on. And so I would think we'd see an emergency shelter that much higher than 3%.
Especially with a longer length of stay that we're seeing, it would have more time to.
And unless the story is, right, and we do know this about our people in shelter, for families anyway, I don't know what it looks like for individuals, but many of our families are working families and they have earned income. And so maybe they're not eligible for unearned income. But if that's the case, we just need to all understand that.
There's a couple of dynamics as well. One is the housing first philosophy. It used to be that when you were in shelter before this housing first philosophy came out, that there were the expectations of you in order to stay. Things like go out and look for a job, those types of things. Also, I think it's the dynamic of how many shelters really have sufficient case management to address the populations that they serve. So that would be an observation of mine. I think that they don't have adequate staff to address the numbers that they serve in the shelters.
It would be interesting to know too, we're measuring the percentage of people who increase like non-employment income. How many people are coming into emergency shelter that already have whatever it is that would be the maximum that they could get from a variety of sources, that because some of that we know that it's not sustaining, and generally it's not meant to be sustaining. And if the goal is to connect people to benefits who don't currently have access or connection, it would be interesting to know how many people are already in our emergency shelter system who already have any benefits they're entitled to or would be entitled to.
Or is there a racial disparity driving this? So one of the things that I don't think we spend enough time understanding that's a racial disparity is the idea that in order for you to receive benefits, you must have your co-parent on child support. And that is a cultural challenge, particularly in the African-American community, because of the fear of criminal justice involvement, right? So is that driving this? I think there's just some questions behind that.
I was just gonna say too, there are connections with the job training and workforce type programs out here. Are they sufficiently connected to the individuals that we serve? And the other aspect is if they're on fixed income, they're maxed out on that and they're unable to work, the next solution is probably gonna have to be either, definitely subsidized or, roommate situations, looking at pairing incomes together to try and make it sustainable. So I don't know. I mean, obviously that doesn't play into those numbers either.
Those metrics are really important to know, but I think if we're gonna be asking that, looking at that, we need to have a box of, has maximized benefits or, does not qualify. So when we get the number of people in those shelters, that we understand, yes, we've gone through the whole system and they're getting their $800 on Social Security disability, that's it. There's no more out there for the government. And so, so we can demonstrate that the people in those case management, in those shelters have gone through that. And this is what we're left with.
I mean, the other thing when I look at this too is it's also maintained. This measure is an increase or maintained. So the rates, they're not even staying where they came in at, it looks like, right? Or we would expect these percentages to be over.
At least
So that's where I look at it, is even maybe a concern, not even about getting more, but are they maintaining?
Karen has got her hand up there.
Go for it, Karen.
Yeah, I think just kind of to tag on what I think Jennifer just said, I'm wondering what tools staff are using to answer this question. So is it a pre and post at entry to shelter to look at, are they maintaining? I think I heard that it's possible that families are already receiving the maximum benefit. So I'm just wondering, when case managers or staff enter this, do they know how to enter that they're maintaining that? I bet it would be higher percentage.
Avery, don't they have to reassess it every 3 months and enter it in HMIS? So, but to your point too, Karen, and I think Commissioner Beckman brought this up as well. This is an area in internal data review that we've had some conversation about. I'm not sure that there's enough staff capacity to update that metric regularly, even though it's required. And so, it may be that all of this is happening and we just don't have the data to understand because it's not entered.
Oftentimes when I'm doing a file review, I'll find it in the file and not in the HMIS. That's a very large thing.
So there's also, I think public housing authorities, and I've been trying to research this for our own housing programs, is an easy way to pull it, but they have access to look up any federal benefits someone's getting already. And I don't know if our shelters have that ability. So they can
I did see this week a new tool came out from Usage, and I never remember what that is. US something.
Interagency council.
Yes. So there's a new tool where you can look at benefits that way, and so I'll push that out. I just saw it yesterday. I don't know if that would be helpful for folks as well.
One thing the state, I'm pleased to see though, is that there appears to be increases of income for folks that are being rapidly housed, which says to me those case managers are helping those folks get their income up, as well as to seem to be pretty steady for those that are permanently housed. It's to the idea of the housing first philosophy that once housed, that folks can address those things like getting their income up and that kind of thing. So I appreciate seeing that from the state, as well as in the transitional housing, you see that there's increases happening.
This doesn't factor in childcare either. So if a parent go back to work, they probably are also having big increases in
So soft spoken.
childcare costs.
Well, I'm finding childcare right now. I mean, that's the other thing, even if you can get an ELC voucher, finding one, so it may be, to your point too, about once they're housed, they're able to finally find a place, where they're going to be and feel comfortable enough putting kids in childcare with them.
Right, Brian?
All right. Yeah, so I don't have too many other notes. There aren't a lot of other things that really stand out. So I can kind of go through the rest pretty quickly while this loads. I will say for income, the one challenge for like shelter, for instance, is that it is something that's supposed to be updated, at enrollment and then at exit. And the one thing we have with shelters, we have about a 50% rate of people disappearing from shelter. So the case manager or the staff doing that intake and exit aren't able to update that information. So that is one of the challenges we face with some of the providers. If someone just disappears, it's going to show as maintained because it's going to show the same amount that they had when they came in. But if they did happen to increase while they were there, that can pose an additional challenge. So there are some kind of data operational challenges for some of the providers that can also impact those numbers. So this is looking at the VI SPDATs, the scores at entry. I think the biggest thing that I would point out from this, because again, we don't see a lot of shift. So it gives us our VI FSPDAT, which is for families with minor children, and then the VI SPDAT, which is for the adult-only households, is that within street outreach, from the previous quarter, we're seeing about a 1-point increase going from an average of 7 to an average of 8 in street outreach for the families with minor children. For the most part, we're seeing everything hold relatively steady. Like there's some slight fluctuations, but that is the one major increase that does show up in the data is an increase in the acuity of families with minor children being served in street outreach. Like I said, the rest of it holds pretty steady. And then the last thing is looking at returns. And so we have, for different committees and looking at data different ways, we've broken out some of this data to look at, the differences in returns from veterans to non-veterans. And we're seeing veterans returning at a higher rate than non-veterans. We started to break that down, trying to look at, what can we see in the data, what's happening there. But overall, when you look at quarter to quarter, we're not seeing a lot of shift. I think the big thing that I just want to point out is just one of those kind of like positive points is that when we look at returns from rapid rehousing for the current quarter, we are down to 7% within 24 months, 5.5% for 12 months compared to 8 and 11%. So it is both really one of the lowest pools. I will point out that homeless prevention is here. It's obviously not returns to homelessness. It is those that exit homeless prevention and remain housed at that point. Do they hit the system in the future? So those are relatively small numbers, which is really good. But when you look at the projects getting people out of a period of homelessness and getting them housed and returns, rapid rehousing is our lowest by a pretty good margin. And that is something that is, I think, a very positive point because rapid rehousing is also our second largest pool of exits. Emergency shelters, where we see the most data from this, usually it's about 1,800 to 2,000 people exiting to permanent housing that show up in the data set. Rapid rehousing is 600 to 800 usually. And so it's by far our second largest pool of people exiting to permanent housing and has one of our lowest return rates, which is, I think, a really important thing to highlight, that even when we're looking at some of the discrepancies in like veteran and non-veteran returns, rapid rehousing is still doing a really good job of keeping people housed. Some of that impact is going to be from some of what's gone on with the pandemic, the eviction moratorium and stuff like that. But generally, rapid rehousing has always been one of our better performers in those counts, especially when you look at the number of people that are being counted. So I think that's the biggest thing I want to point out from this is just how low that return rate is. Again, with the note that some of it may be impacted by some of what's gone on with the pandemic and evictions, the ability to return to shelter, stuff like that. But it's still a very positive thing that I think is worth kind of noting and celebrating.
What do you think it is that makes those rapid rehousing numbers so positive? I mean, what are some of the factors that go into that category that we can put in other categories?
So I think it depends a little bit on which pool we compare it to. So if we look at like shelter, the big thing with shelter is some people are exiting shelter with rapid rehousing assistance or going into permanent supportive housing, or maybe they have a housing choice voucher or something that's providing them assistance. But the other thing is some of them may be temporarily self-resolving, or maybe they have just enough income to try to get in somewhere, so they need some deposit assistance. So there are some challenges, I think, when you look at that data. It's also self-report, so some of it could be that someone says they're staying in a rental or staying with a family or friend on a permanent basis, but that ends up not being the case, or it's not stable. And so I think it's that stability issue that comes up with something like emergency shelter. transitional housing can be similar. When you look at Safe Haven, it's a small pool, but Safe Haven is also very high needs clients, usually with multiple disabilities and needs further assistance, and generally should be probably going from Safe Haven to permanent supportive housing so they get that ongoing assistance. And so I think the one thing with rapid rehousing we see is that there is that case management aspect when they get housed to try and establish some other supports. Avery, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that, but I think that's the biggest thing I see is the ability to provide assistance after they get housed, not just getting them into the housing unit and then they kind of go off on their own.
That is really one of the largest factors.
And that's what so there's that case management aspect to establish other supports and provide assistance after they get housed.
Absolutely.
So that's where we need to,
Yes. When you look at some of the returns with the veterans, we know that VASH returns at a higher rate. And one of those is because there's not enough that support. The gentlemen and the women often will say when they come back into the system, I just can't do it.
alone.
I can't do it alone. I needed the support that I got here from Safe Haven or.
So I'm curious on that with PSH, because it does have that ongoing support. I don't know how the staffing levels are for that, but are people that get those from PSH units, are they still leaving them, like to return to homelessness? I mean, is that what that data is showing for the 2025?
Well, I think you also have to recognize that as the populations are the population and, rapid rehousing is a much bigger population.
Okay.
And so if you have exits from people leaving permanent supportive housing and then return, it's a smaller population. So you'll have a greater opportunity to skew the numbers if any one or two people
So
changes.
that would explain why the numbers for permanent supportive housing, excess back to homelessness are almost identical. They almost equal what it is for emergency shelter. You look at the 24 months versus the 12 months, they're almost the same. And permanent supportive housing, you mentioned that it could be a smaller number that's driving that percentage up. Is that correct?
Yeah, because if you look, Brian, how many people within this, permanent supportive housing, yeah. So you're looking at
95 exited,
exited,
24 came back.
and then if you look at rapid rehousing, same numbers, what just the volume.
So I guess that's the other point, though.
Could
is
you,
most
could
people
you
don't
scroll over
exit
emergency shelter?
Yeah, I would see that one too. So that's a much bigger population.
So PSH, you'd almost be measuring not the exits, but the total population, because most people don't leave PSH, right?
Right.
Towards the end. So it's measuring with that program, not how many exits, but how many ended up back.
And then to know that a lot of the permanent supportive housing, the folks that are there have some of the highest acuities. So maybe more likely to leave, have,
Brian, can we go back to that slide that was on the acuities? I think it was right before this one. Because I found it interesting that acuities, the average acuities for permanent supportive housing were at 9, so almost 10, but we just changed the levels for rapid rehousing to encompass 9s and 10s, did we not?
Yes, we did.
And so I found that kind of interesting because I was thinking the same thing, that these are people that have mental challenges, so they're they might return to homelessness is a possibility, but anyway, thank you, Brian.
Yep, you're welcome.
Anything else you want to highlight, Brian?
No, I think that's it.
I will share, I know we're over our time, but I padded some of our other areas, so I'll share. I have too many things open. One thing that, just so you can see it, you can tell me if you would like that in future meetings. Brian, kudos to him, has done an amazing job creating some reports that the county has requested. And I just think the visual tells us a lot that is important for you to see. Sorry, I'm closing.
While she's doing that, I want to just shout out Brian for doing a report, a special report I asked for. I had been asked to do a White Creek Mountain Rapid Housing Program since its inception, and I appreciate the data that you gave me, Brian. It was very helpful.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad it helped.
And to remind folks that that once they're completed and ready to go, the data dashboards are on the website for the HLA. There's a Pinellas HMIS drop-down menu, and the dashboards are in that, and you can, they're not static, so you can look at all different, like by program type or demographics. That's all available on the HLA website.
So to get to the question that y'all were asking about earlier about how long they stay, this doesn't actually show this, but Brian's going to produce this monthly that helps us understand how many active we have in each acuity level, families versus individuals. And then, how many are referred right now, how many are enrolled. So active is the waiting, right? But I thought this particular graph was really important that I want to watch over time. There's a couple of things that this could be telling us. If you look at the 11 plus or 4 to 10 on the, October, November end, you would want to see, in my opinion, referred and enrolled pretty close together, right? That means that the people who we refer actually say, yes, I want the assistance, and enroll in the program. And this is getting further apart. And so what does that mean? Do we not have good data in HMIS for people to call case managers? Is this a difference we're experiencing, which I think could be a part of it? When families were in a single site shelter and they didn't answer the phone, it was really easy for Teresa to say, hey, Duggan, they called you today, you didn't answer, because she saw Duggan every day, right? When they're in hotel and not in one site, that can be more challenging. And so I wonder if that is driving some of this. We know that we have a lot of people returned to the list, and that is slowing down our system and flow because they have so many days to wait that they have to try to make contact. When they don't, they can return them to the list and pick up somebody else. But then we lost days keeping somebody else in housing, right? So we lowered that in the last COC board meeting, just a few days to test that and see if that helps. We'll see over time. But I thought this was something to draw your attention to. And then when I went over this particular one with Karen, I said, like, this is not what you want to see. This is like flat line. We are dead in the water. In many ways, it's good, right? There's not that gap between referred and enrolled. But look, we're not referring individuals at all because we're spending so much time on families, and individuals drive our data because there's so many. And it drives our outcomes for HUD. And so, we go through these pendulum swings in the COC where people have beliefs about rules that aren't true. And so one belief that I know I've heard over time is we have to prioritize families over individuals. There is no rule that says that. There is no prioritization scheme in our COC that says that. And so, it's something for us to keep having conversations about. I know Teresa, she's sitting there rolling her eyes at me because she says it in every meeting, but there is in the Rapid Rehousing Collaborative that the county runs, for example, right? They do not have to take families over individuals. I believe the COC has helped create this problem ourselves because we didn't have an individual list and we didn't keep it in front of people. We've made that change. Now we're doing case conferencing. I think what you see is what you work on. And so hopefully we'll see some difference here. But I just want, as funders, funding also drives what gets referred. And so wanted to make sure you're aware of this.
Amy, with that, I think on a jurisdictional level, there's two components to it. So in my mind, thinking about how to turn the faucet off longer term is, kind of like that ACE, risk analysis, thinking about if a kid is in and out of homelessness while they're growing up, what's their likelihood that these are now the adults we're dealing with. And I think that's more of a jurisdictional thing for us, to work on, both making sure there's decent housing, do they have access to childcare, do they have safe parks to play in, good access to schools and things like that, try and prevent later on. But at the same point, taking the approach kind of like the Built for Zero, where you hone in on some of these critically difficult populations to get to the point that you're caught up enough. So kind of on both sides. So I kind of see the HLA's role trying to address that harder problem and jurisdictions a little bit, longer term thinking in terms of raising kids in safe, decent environments with good education and things like that to help them not be in that situation.
I think this is the other thing. I know I shared this at the last COC board meeting, but I think it's really important for funders to consider. This is our inflow of newly homeless clients, and in the orange and the blue is prevention clients. Again, kudos to Brian for putting this together for me. And you can really see as those prevention dollars, ERA, DCF gave us prevention dollars, that's keeping our numbers down. And so when all those programs in, if we want to continue to see less inflow, you may hear us have conversations over the next year about, what resources should we shift? Should we focus on rapid rehousing, or should we prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place with our resources? Because it's a lower cost intervention anyway. And so I did share this at the last COC board meeting, but as everybody's opening funding and we're talking about things, I think it's really important for you to see how drastic this difference makes over time when prevention dollars are increased.
And I think what's not accounted for in that graph, because we don't track it as a system, is the massive amount of money that has come to like ERA. So hopefully folks not even on even close to the radar of our system that would be able to maintain their housing that would otherwise be, possibly moving toward our homeless system. And that's millions of dollars, regardless of the speed of those transactions, it's still millions of dollars that is keeping people hopefully housed.
And it points to advocacy conversations we need to have as a COC. The child tax credit has expired. I believe that has kept a lot of our families out of the system. And so is that something as a COC we want to do some federal advocacy around? Because that little bit of difference helps. So
well, and it's part of that is about sort of smoothing out some of the spikes and valleys we've seen in the system. Folks go to do, especially families go to file early in their tax return to get earned income tax credit, child tax credit, things like that, and don't have as, and it may have changed in the last year or two, but generally we see less people looking for assistance come February, March, April, and then it starts to creep up again. But having those programs stretch out over a year-long period of time and provide monthly income instead of that spike in income, could be far more helpful.
I think it'll be interesting to monitor this tax season too, to see if we still get that little bit of a lull because they were getting it all year, right? To see how that impacts them. Like if they're expecting a huge return, they're not going to get what they got in prior years because they've gotten it throughout.
That's a misunderstanding of people that it was a prepaid tax credit. They got the one that they typically get this year was sent to them in months prior to.
When they go to file their taxes, they're gonna be awakened.
Yes,
and not
but
get
but I don't think, the good news is like, in that case, if you also qualify for like the earned income tax credit, that was not prepaid to people, so still have eligibility for earned income tax credit, but still, if you're counting on both, and you don't see one of them, that could be very significant for a family. So,
Well, plus the report to the IRS is gonna be way, plus processing things issue, so.
file early. All right, let's talk about, Avery, you're gonna help us walk through the race equity toolkit.
Yes, I am. Okay, so you all got a copy of the rough draft, the very first draft of the race equity toolkit. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee was not able to meet in January. So when we meet in February, we're going to take your feedback and have it in there, and they're going to get a really nice draft. So I wanted to go over the content of this. And remember, the purpose was to help the providers getting ready for contracts to include requirements for equity. So we took and adapted from the Housing Development Corp Consortium Race Equity Toolkit from Washington. Why recreate something that was already out there? And we also applied the Washington Race Equity and Justice Initiative's Race Equity Toolkit. We couldn't make up our mind which one we liked best, so we said, hey, let's combine them. Let's take the best from both and combine them so that we have something for our county. It includes education on race equity. That is a history section that is not just fair housing, but we also count Pinellas County history and included that. And then also power of language. Know the difference. Definitions, which we used our COC definitions that were approved. And then conversations on race. How do you have them? And we included with that a worksheet with guidelines that has it. There is role-playing activities and exercises that are included. Then identification. We talk about race equity and you as a person, as well as an organization. So what are some dominant culture characteristics? Program and project design. What are considerations when you are creating a new project? Keep in mind when you're looking at race equity, and that the importance is incorporating the voice of those with lived experience. And then creation and implementation. This is where the heart of what the work of the committee did was on the organizational self-assessment tool. We spent, I believe, almost 2 months working on the assessment tool. And what it was that we just liked too many of the assessment tools, so we had to combine them all and then go through question by question to make sure it is applicable to our providers. And where they weren't, we took them out. And then we finalize it with what can you do? And there is an organizational plan, and it is based off of that self-assessment tool. In fact, within the plan, and they're very simple plans, by the way. These are not long, detailed things. They're very simple. We have comments in it where, okay, if you're struggling with this section, go back to here in the toolkit. This might help you. And then we also do a race equity impact tool, and that is just a step-by-step how to consider the impact of the organizational's work before you go forward. Within the appendix, I decided that it didn't make sense to have it in the toolkit itself. It was just making it too bulky, so I pulled stuff out and put in there. We've got not just those role-playing activities, but what's the difference between tracking community outcomes and evaluating the outcomes of a change strategy? What is an example of a race equity culture for continuum of organizations? And then what do community agreements look like that organizations can create? So that is a very, very, very high level of it. I can go in more detail if you want to of what's in each section, just to highlight a little bit more. I know that one thing that was very important to the providers And so we made sure to include it was in organizational commitment hiring practices and some examples of things to do there. So we look at creating a more equitable organizational culture as well as recruiting, hiring, and retaining a diverse workforce. Hiring specifically has its own section, and then transforming impact.
I do have this on your agenda as an action item, but that was when we believed that diversity, equity, and inclusion was going to pass it first, and they didn't have quorum this month. So it's okay if you don't pass it because you want to have it referred from them after they've done their final look. But we always want to make sure, especially because the intent of this was to get providers ready for funders to hold them accountable at a later date, that you're aware of it. You can choose to pass it today or not, but I just wanted to provide some context that originally it was an action item. You may choose to allow diversity, equity, and inclusion to recommend it to the board, since it may not be in its final format today. But we are looking for input.
I think we should wait for the recommendation. I think it's fantastic. Our city in particular is looking at this type of thing. All right, we just approved it. Be nice.
And what are as we're looking at organizations that are funded or a part of the COC, like what are our ultimate expectations of organizations? And how does this work with what we're expecting?
I think the big,
Well, and possibly that, but just in general, what are we looking to be the outcome for organizations?
I mean, I think the stance that we've taken right now, and Avery, feel free to add on to this, is we've incorporated into any NOFOs that we have put out to at least start the conversation. We're not holding people accountable yet per se in the scoring, but we're asking for what are their plans and trying to make sure that it is something that is getting incorporated into organizations. At some point, HUD may require us to do more, and that is our intent, is that this would, move forward in a progressive way. We know this work doesn't happen overnight. And the toolkit is that first step to give providers a tool to help them down that path. Some of our funders already ask these questions and score based on certain things, like what does your board makeup look like, and things of that nature. But I do think, I guess that, the other thing that I think about from a funder's perspective is if we are going to become a more equitable COC, and HUD has charged us to incorporate organizations that serve, work in, know our diverse community. Most RFPs, including our own, do not allow for that kind of equity to happen. And I'm just going to use an example. If we are requiring that you have a track record, you've already had government money, you are doing this program in this county right now, that doesn't allow us to bring in more diverse organizations. And so that's a future conversation. I think that we need to get our current providers more competent, but we also need to figure out how to shift our funding requirements to allow for other organizations to be able to apply. And that is HUD's directive, by the way. So that is something we are continually having to look at. And I know that Pinellas Community Foundation and Foundation for Healthy St. Pete has done a lot of work on that and did with the CARES Act to build capacity of smaller organizations. And so how do we carry that into our COC work and partner people together and write NOPOs that allow for that?
The organizational assessment that is in here really breaks down so much. It goes into very fine detail in regards to board development, hiring, programming, policy. It's very heavy on policy development because I believe that is where a lot of our providers are struggling, is with the recruitment, the maintenance of staff, maintaining staff, training. How do you train? How do you have conversations about equity, about race within your organization? So it's very heavy on that and teaching and training. So that's where we were really going with the toolkit, was a start. This is a jump start. How could you create a plan for your organization based on this?
It's fantastic to be ahead of the game a bit, you know, I mean, not really like nationally ahead of the game, you know, like as far as our history, but to take it out.
We'll just have to see if the state of Florida decides to regulate how we're allowed to deal with that.
Exactly. Right. We'll feel that, now we can't have that conversation.
If the government wants to start regulating people's feelings, we'll see what we have to deal with that.
I think that's a bit.
Well, as a funder, it's nice to know, you know, there's maybe somewhat of a standard evaluation process. To me, that's really helpful, you know, because sometimes it's hard to really evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of an organization when you're trying to fund it.
I was just gonna say, I think that's a big thing that, I mean, many agencies and even businesses have been probably feeling throughout this whole pandemic, is there's been such a shift every which way, and then trying to navigate, you know, which rule supersedes what and where I am, and then there's, you know, there's county rights, and now like there's the new tenant rights at city levels and things like that. So I think there's a lot of just continuous training that's going to be needed to help navigate as things are changing. I think it's different aspects.
So you think this would be finalized at the next funders council meeting or vote?
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, if DEI approves it this month, then it'll be on the March COC board agenda.
Which means it would not come back.
Correct.
Right.
You know, I was just thinking about too, with you were talking about the data and availability of units too. I think that's helpful for jurisdictions to kind of know which household sizes are seeing the strain the most. You know, is there a need for a ton more little efficiency units, or are we really lacking in, you know, 2 to 3 bedroom apartments? Because we have these huge complexes coming in all over the county, but if there's a way to incentivize some of the, you know, the types of units that we might need based on what we're seeing with the most vulnerable population, not the folks moving here from up north, then maybe we can help align some of our incentives towards.
So I would be comfortable with allowing the DEI committee to make the final look and recommendation directly to the board. I think that providers will have seen it again.
Yes.
After that, I think since the most impact is related to the providers, I feel comfortable just not taking action today and allowing DEI to make a recommendation that the providers will then consider it. Recommendation will go to the board based on, because they meet before the board.
Yes, they do.
Okay, I'm comfortable with that. No one else is.
I'm okay with that.
Thank you.
All right, very good. HMIS policies and procedures update.
Okay, you do not have a draft of all the changes, but we did provide you with an executive summary. This will be going to data and system performance. Again, this is kind of a syncing issue, but we wanted to make you aware of what changes would be coming. There's nothing major here that I would draw your attention to. Policy 1.9 around licensing fees, we're not increasing fees, y'all did that last year. But we're just separating it out so they understand when they're gonna be invoiced and that kind of thing. We also clarify what constitutes a report or a custom assessment, because that is currently in the policies that it's $25 an hour, but we haven't been charging that. And we are at a place where we are getting asked for so many customized reports, we don't have the staff to support it. And so we need to provide some distinction of, if this is a system need, then that's a system report we should be running. If this is an agency level report and kind of clarifying some of that, we will include I don't want to call it an exception policy, but a way for providers to make their case, let's say, that this really is an important system level thing we need to understand by bringing that to data and system performance. So that will all be written out. Then we already have a.
Let me ask on that real quick.
Uh-huh.
So if we don't have the staffing capability right now, I should say capacity to deal with like custom stuff at the volume that it's coming in.
What's our strategy?
Does the hourly charge, does that adequately reflect the cost if we want to get there? Or would there be an option to say, through our HMIS folks, we could get the vendor to do stuff, but that's $150 an hour that an agency could pay for if they so wanted to do that.
Yes, and it does right now tell them what the cost is for WellSky to do it.
Okay.
If we can do it, so there's a couple of strategies here. We are running training classes for agencies to learn how to do their own reporting and creating canned reports so that they can do that on their own. In addition to that, you just saw some very detailed reports that are new that Brian's running for the system level. So some of those things should be able to help providers. We are also building into other funding requests right now, additional HMIS support that we've gotten through ESGCV and now need to maintain because there are so many new projects coming into HMIS creating these challenges because of all the funding on the street with all these COVID dollars. So it's not always about the number of agencies. I'll just use one agency may have 60 different projects, and before COVID they had 20, right? And so that's driving these changes. But Duggan, it's a good point. $25 an hour is not going to get us to the level we need to be, but we're also trying to be very sensitive to budgets that organizations also have.
Sure.
The annual refresher process is already a process that's required by HMIS, but we clarify because we're using a new tool called Talent where they can do that online. So we're creating some clarification around that. We're updating client release of information and informed consent to be one document instead of having to do multiple releases. And we also are revising some corrective action and risk level things that have come up over the last year that has helped us understand how to further define that. So this is just informational for you at this time. Data and system performance will review those full written policies, and then they will go to the COC board in March. Because that is heavy reading, we will try to get that COC board packet out in advance so you have some extra time to read.
Any questions or issues from folks on the updated HMIS policies and procedures? All right, let's do funder updates and some of our planning. This is really for all of us. I guess we can start with any major updates from funders at the table, new things coming online or updates that would benefit the entire system. Go for it. anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, for us in Clearwater, some of you were, Doug, and you were on the call that we had. We're starting our process for planning our home ARP money, $1.6 million and change. And that money needs to be spent towards a qualified population, which is people which are the homeless or people facing the imminent threat of homeless. So we had a workshop and brought in a bunch of organizations that we thought might be interested in applying for those funds. Right now, we're in that application process. Then shortly after that, we'll start our standard annual process for our annual action plan, which funds a lot of the same organizations with some of the same activities.
And Chuck, just for clarity, because one of the intents of this is to help us plan as the COC, but also there's so many opportunities right now. Our providers are struggling, including myself. CDBG-CV may also be funded in this cycle based on what may end up being submitted in public services. Is that right?
Yes, we have some remaining CDBG-CV funds, so we've re-advertised that and we're making that available during this funding cycle.
And how much is in that pot?
Probably in the neighborhood of $600,000 to $700,000.
And less for funders, more for providers who may watch this recording later. Qualified populations for home ARP. The activities include, correct me, Chuck, non-congregate shelter, supportive services, tenant-based rental assistance,
Yep.
and nonprofit capacity building.
Correct.
Okay. And that deadline is next Friday.
Next Friday, February 4th.
Does the city of Largo also have that same funding?
We do not get
Okay.
promised.
So in our community, would that be coming in only through Clearwater, St. Pete, and then the county itself?
For those
The
types of,
home ARP funding?
that's correct. Yeah, we didn't get any ARP funding, and the home allocation we get each year is just part of the county's portion, and so it's for down payment and home buyer or in owner rehab right now.
Okay, so the traditional home.
It was distributed to home entitlement communities.
Yeah.
Right. Okay,
I think it's the county, St. Pete, and us are the only ones.
okay. And does anyone know, did the state get an allocation?
It's a good question.
Through
I
home
can
ARP?
look that up. I may be able to look it up while we get updates.
Okay, all right.
Do not believe the state got the ARP funding on the home piece.
Thank you.
If it has, I haven't seen it.
Thank you.
Can I ask- So Clearwater got about 1.6 million in home ARP funding, and we had a workshop where a bunch of organizations who might apply for those funds came in. Can you share like a couple? Did anything stand out to you? Are you looking to partner with St. Pete and St. Pete got home ARP funding?
Yeah, but St. Pete has put forward their plan for American Rescue Plan Act dollars, but they have not put anything out yet on ARP. Joshua is on the call. Maybe when Joshua does his update, he can share.
I just didn't know if the two cities would want to collaborate or
Well,
not,
it's hard that our funds ain't getting spent in Clearwater.
just in
Yeah,
Clearwater.
and what we're doing is we're gonna put together a technical review committee. Doug is on that committee. Amy will have a representative on that committee, Salvation Army. They're gonna review the applications, and we're gonna get feedback from that committee on really where we need to spend this money based on the applications that we receive. So it's not just gonna be us internally picking winners and losers. We're gonna get some very valuable feedback
Good.
from some very strong professionals in this field.
And what about a timeline for that?
Well, the application closes February 4th. The TRC meeting is 2 weeks later. And then it's a matter of putting the plan together and public comment period, going to council, going to sending it to HUD. Really, early summer would be probably a decent expectation.
Okay, for decision.
Well, for getting through the approval process,
Okay.
and then it's a matter of getting
So
contracts out.
one of the challenges I've noticed that providers have with this process, it's taken me time to kind of connect all the dots, is last year when everybody kept getting confused and they weren't building their HMIS programs and whatever, I'm like, well, which pot did you get money from? And they would be like, what are you talking about? Now I understand more that when there's a consolidated plan, you're putting forward an idea that meets the goals of, the city, municipality, and then staff do the hard work of blending the puzzle, right? Going, this is ESG, this is CDBG, this is home, this is this. So once you're funded, which pot you're in, right? But it takes so long because that's not the last step. It's got to go before council and then it's got to go to HUD and HUD has to approve it. And maybe 8 months later when they get their contract. And then when you get your contract, you get that community's written standards, which really drives everything. Chuck's written standards are different than COC written standards. County's written standards are different than Chuck's. St. Pete, same thing. And so now I understand why providers are like, wait a minute, I didn't understand what all I was supposed to do and what the rules were and how to build the HMIS. So that's something I want to help unpack. But it's just the nature of the beast. They've had money the way it, works that, the committee can make the decision next week. It's still going to be 8 months before the program can start, and that makes it challenging.
I mean, we have a timeline that we get this to HUD by the end of May. It's very aggressive. And then even following that, it's a matter of getting contracts together. A lot of work involved.
Arrow, anything City of Largo new?
We're finalizing that agreement, if you guys are too, right, for the housing navigation services. That'll be a new service added with HLA. So we're going to be sharing that. For that, and we are not opening new funding cycles right now. We'll be meeting with our CDBG CV folks soon just to get an update on how it's going, if they're seeing shifts in demand, and we'll kind of make an evaluation at that time if we need to shift anything. I think those are the biggest ones. Just trying to get units built as fast as we've got lots in process. We just can't snap our fingers.
Great. JWP.
So we will be having, unfortunately, well, it's kind of the same. It's going to be a while till the funding actually goes, gets to the street. But we are expecting February to take an LOI process to the board for 3 of our 5 strategic focus areas. First up to be under prevention of abuse and neglect, early childhood development, and our strengthening communities. And we're going to do the LOI process first to be abbreviated, and then we will shortlist folks, and then we'll do a full RFP. The whole time frame cycles for contracts to get out services to start implementation in February of next year. But the 3 will go, and then several months later, the following 2 strategic focus areas will go, which is the school readiness and school success. New programs, not expansion of current programs. So that will be forthcoming very shortly.
JWP, so February is when the LOIs will go to the board for abuse, early childhood development, and strengthening communities. Remind me what
PCAM, prevention of abuse and neglect is a third one.
And then school readiness and school success.
They're working on that timeline. So they go to the board in February. We expect applications to come back in April, just to give you a timeline.
Okay.
And then we'll shortlist in June. We'll probably re-release the RFP portion for those folks in August is roughly the time frame. It's still being finalized with procurement. The goal for the second set is that we would have them up and running in time for the following school year, right? So,
and then you said the new funding.
so it's not for existing programs that receive money from
Okay.
JWB. It's only, so like the current program who wants to do additional services, this would not be the application process for them. This is for something that's not currently funded by JWB. It could be a program in the community that we don't support right now that they want to do more of, but not something that we already fund.
All right, so pretty much the biggest thing that we're working on right now is substantial amendments for our CDBG action plans. We're actually doing 2019, 2020, and 2021. We have 20% of our CDBG allocated for planning and administration. And honestly, it's just not really realistic for us to have that much money just sitting there for planning and administration. So our substantial amendment is going to council on the 10th of February to allocate that pretty much to different activities that we have. One of them for the CV1 is for directions for living in the homeless prevention program. So we do have something trying to go toward that. And then once we get that new money, we'll get our contracts out. So get that started.
Awesome. Josh. All right. Teresa says Josh. Josh, do you want to give us an update of City of St. Petersburg?
Talking to me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Okay, for the city of St. Petersburg, we're currently, administration has our RFP and they're reviewing it for the multifamily element and for the case management and supportive permanent housing element. That part is $1 million. Teresa has an element that I think she did an RFP for and placed it out there in the general public maybe a few weeks ago. But this is the remaining elements of the ARPA funding as it pertains to housing. So that should be coming up soon and placed in purchasing to receive responses. Joe has the exact numbers of our ERA activities, but we have completed ERA 1. We've almost completed ERA 2 with approximately $250,000 remain to be committed. And we will be out of money, and we've talked with the county, and the county has agreed to fund applicants in the city after our funding is depleted. We are funding our ERA, our ESG CV clients or nonprofits, such as Catholic Charities, Directions for Living, St. Vincent de Paul, HLA, Gulf Coast Legal, but we still have some funds available, ESGCV, and we've canvassed our public service nonprofits to inquire whether they needed additional ESGCV funds. And so far, there have been no takers, but we will continue to try and put this money out there. Likewise, we have some funding available from CDBG-CV, and we will go out with a NOFA shortly. That funding is available until, I believe, October 2026. So we have some time with that. We will be planning our 3 million home project soon. We went to council last month to accept the funding, and they've approved it. So now we have to go out in the community and conduct a planning process of how we're going to spend the home funds. It's approximately a little more than $3 million. Our current annual action plan, we are in process of conducting that. We've had our first public forum. We're now going to have our review with clients who are submitting applications on February 2nd. We will assist them with completing their applications for funding for the FY 2022-2023 consolidated plan / annual action plan funding. And that is what I have for the city.
Joshua, can I something down, so I want to check on it. The home that you said you need to start planning for, is that normal home or is that home art?
That's ARPA.
And how much? was that?
A little more than $3 million. I don't have the exact, but it's a little more than $3 million. And that can provide assistance to many of the agencies here with respect to transitional housing, people who need assistance with tenant-based rental assistance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to be conducted pretty shortly. Stephanie and I will roll that out.
Okay, and then one other clarification question. I know that the non-congregate shelter RFP closed recently. The supportive services million, has that RFP hit the street?
Not yet. Administration has it. I was told that be prepared to roll it out sometime, within the next few days.
Okay.
And the shelter, family emergency shelter, as you mentioned, closed last Thursday, and going to evaluate.
I know that there's some things you can't share when something's under review. Can you share if there were multiple applicants?
I cannot.
Okay.
It's $2.5 million to fund that, and the funds will be expended through December 2024. Right. Families that are really homeless.
All right, thank you. Joe, do you want to talk to us about county updates?
Yes, sir, I can. I'll start on our normal run-of-the-mill business of, we opened our normal application round Wednesday of this week, which will be our CDBG, our ESG funding, our normal round of applications. As well as with that round of applications, we also opened back up our CDBG CV as well as our ESG CV funding. So we will be running all of those together between now and February 25th at 5 p.m. The applications will close. We will be putting out there about $1.8 million worth of our normal CDBG funding. And of course, with this set of funding, we will start the annual action plan process to get to the Board of County Commissioners in July to be able to submit our annual action plan for our normal funding that will become available October 1. So that process has opened up with our CDBG CV and our ESG CV. Again, we've opened that up. We have approximately 1.7 million of CDBG CV that we have available, and about $2.8 million of ESG CV. So that application round is open and moving forward. Our home art funds, we're in the process of getting ready to engage a consultant to start working on our allocation plan, which must be done prior to amending our action plan to get it submitted to HUD. But hopefully within the next 30 days, we'll be able to get that consultant engaged and begin our annual the allocation plans for the home art funds to move forward. We received an allocation of a little over $4.7 million of the home art funds for the county as a whole. So we'll begin that process hopefully very soon and get that ball rolling. I think on the county's, the other side, I heard Amy mention the American Rescue Plan. The county has set aside $19 million of that overall allocation for a nonprofit capital program, capital funds program. That right now is being run with our American Rescue Plan project manager. They're putting together that plan, doing some needs assessments, that those funds will be coming sometime this year. I'm not sure. We have been kind of on the periphery yet, but that process is going for $19 million through the American Rescue Plan. I think, let's see. I think that's our normal operations that we normally have going on. And then that other little program we've been running for over the last 9 months, the emergency rental assistance. As of yesterday's check run, the county had assisted 2,635 households for a total of $21,393,055. For the city of St. Pete, they have expended $10,388,308 and assisted 1,243 households. And as I've looked at these numbers over the last week or so, you see those together and then you put them together and we realize that we've assisted over 3,800 households and we've expended $31.7 million in the last 10 months to assist people in staying stably housed. So it's been a Herculean effort. It's been a community effort, not only with providing the funding, but our community partners that we've had out here that have assisted and everything. It's been a big effort. We do still have a long way to go. As Joshua says, we're putting together those workflows and everything else to bring St. Pete into use the county funding. Right now, with that happening, we anticipate maybe late July, early August, that we will have most of these funds expended and begin that process of closing out. So we still have a ways to go, a good bit of money to continue to assist these individuals. One of the things, again, we've got an 18-month cap on the number of months that we've got. So we still have people that are working their way through their 18 months. So we will continue that process. I think that is everything I had on my sheet here to speak about. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, this is Kathleen Beckman with Clearwater. So I understand that Clearwater, St. Pete, and the county have they have the ARP home funds, and then we all have the other ARPA funds. So I'm just wondering, as I advocate for certain things that are important to me, you know, and to my constituents, housing and social service support and case management, things like that. Is there coordination between St. Pete, Clearwater, and the county as far as those home funds, those ARP home funds? So we're not duplicating. I guess I understand that they've got to stay in our area, but you know, is there a communication between the three bigger players about what you're planning to do with our home funds? And then, you know, I just, there's all this money and it'd just be nice if people knew what they were all doing.
And I think that's going to be a part of this allocation plan process that the county's getting ready to do. All of our jurisdictions will be invited to that plan, to be a part of that planning process. We've always worked together that if we have a project that the city of St. Pete or the city of Clearwater provides funding, we will come in and assist in providing additional funding and partnering on a project like that. So if that project is serving the county as a whole. So yes, they will be involved in the planning process. They will be invited to do that. As those projects begin coming together, if there's that opportunity to collaborate or we need additional funds that the county can assist with, we'll come in and look at that. So yes, ma'am, we all work together. We talk about it, and that'll be a part of the county's allocation plan as we work toward getting it approved.
So if we get an application through our system, through our program, and there's an opportunity, you know, to double up with the county, Joe's the first person I'm going to call because I know they'll consider that, and there's the opportunity to do that, certainly, you know, depending on what the programs are, what's being requested, the amount of financing that's being requested. We have open conversations when these opportunities come up, so.
So an example of that, Kathleen, may be like Chuck and I talked about a shelter in Clearwater, for example, right? And he talked to the county about if this served county residents, could we go in together on that? And I know that Chuck and Eero worked together on the housing navigation for Clearwater and Largo. I think, on the flip of that, this week I've been giving thought to how do we as a COC help our providers figure out how to do this when our funders can't. So, for example, when my team looked at what we need to apply for with everything that's open, we were like, oh, we need more X in, let's say prevention in Clearwater based on the data. Largo's so close, Largo's data shows the same thing. Can we put that together? Right. And so I think, what can we as a COC do to help with that? I know I've been making calls to providers over the last couple of weeks, just making sure they know all the things that are open and they know the meeting Chuck's having and the consolidated plan meeting that Largo and the county's having, because there's so much. I worry things get lost. And so how can we help providers also plan in addition to the funders?
Sure.
I hate to ask this because I know everyone's so busy right now, but with those funds running out this summer and jurisdictions are kind of making decisions on ARPA now, I think those are almost the two groups that are almost planning a little bit separately, like they have our information, but our CDBG and home group, we meet every month still and discuss things, but I'm just concerned that there's going to be several people that are already, have extended their 18 months. There's no other assistance necessarily, or how are we transitioning? And when that funding stops, is there going to be a significant cliff that we need to start thinking if ARPA needs to help have a system in place and ready for that or not?
I think one of the things we could go back to for the next funders meeting possibly is, we were doing that chart for a long time. I think we need to go back and take a look at that. I think for Pinellas County, we need more information, like St. Pete had theirs delineated out by program. So we knew this is how much was in prevention with which folks. We could get Pinellas County to delineate that a little bit more. It may help you look at that from the big picture perspective. And that's something that I think we would have time at the next funders council to really start to dig into.
And this is a little bit different, so I want to make sure discussion wise we're done here. Okay. So, and I know being new to the group too, like some of the other challenges I think we face is going back to what Amy was talking about from a provider's perspective. Even when we are partnering, they're still getting multiple contracts from multiple government entities and jurisdictions with a lot of their own rules and regulations, right? So are there continued ways to look at ways to partner to say, okay, we'll hand X over to you and you will be the lead? Or I just think opportunities to try to explore that, help our providers be able to manage the different flow if it's when it's possible.
I will say that I have a lot of conversation with providers who recently have missed out on opportunities or maybe have received funding in a certain pot before, like St. Pete social action funding, and didn't get it. Instead of there being a fear for the loss of services to the clients, which is what all of this is about, there's relief that serving 10 masters is impossible as a CEO. And I am sensing that rise from our providers. And at some point there may be a good time for providers and funders to meet together for you to hear that from each other, because my biggest fear, which is why I asked Teresa if it was non-responsive or if there were multiple bidders, is that we have all this money on the street. As a system, I'm planning for people to get that money. And then when that doesn't happen, because people stop asking, you heard Joshua say, Nobody needs more money. Well, I'm gonna tell you, people need more money. They don't want to go through the hoops they have to deal with. And so then that means there's gonna be gaps in the system. And so how do we talk about that? Or, you know, it's non-responsive in such a way that you have to go back out to bid, which is double the work for you as funder staff, and you're already overtaxed. And so I think about those kinds of things, and I feel that tension rising from providers. I don't want to be putting words in their mouth, but you heard it at the last COC board meeting, and those discussions are, you know, continuing on a regular basis at this point.
I think we have that too as funders. We're all managing a lot more contracts than usual.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to have any good, you know, interaction, oversight, or technical assistance. There's so many. So anyway, we can collaborate and streamline. Like we're sharing the, you know, our agreement language for the HLA one, just to make sure we're not asking different things, all that stuff. And luckily, like now, most of us are on Neighborly, so at least some of the reporting looks the same. You know, you can plunk in your report for each jurisdiction and it's the same exact stuff. But yeah, I hear you. I can only imagine for some of these nonprofits.
And I think, yeah, I mean, that's the purpose of these meetings and the planning together, right? And I know that every funder is also overtaxed. Everyone's saying, I can't procure anything. It's like, we can't do it. It's not possible. But lean on the COC, right? I mean, Kaylee, right now that funding source will change, but she is our TA person for ESGCV and is pulling all that stuff down from HUD and sitting with people one-on-one to do that technical assistance. And so is there things that we as a COC can help you with if you're not able to give that technical assistance to a provider? Because we may already be sitting down with them for some of that. So it's just something that I think we can continue to work on.
Or even maybe more opportunities for like, but like a lead agency type where someone could take and one could manage the inflow, right? And then all the money's put together from there. But I'm just trying to think outside the box to try to streamline as much as possible. I know.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, Jennifer, is done in communities. I know I've at least talked to Karen about this briefly, but COCs can be unified funding agencies where everything comes into them and then it's all distributed from one source. So it's one contract, and we certainly don't have the infrastructure for that right now, but it may be a goal that we work towards as a community at some point.
I think one of the other things we struggle with, I know we have at least 3 different head reps. I think St. Pete's got a
And we all get different
we get
answers.
different answers. And so I think keep having to modify our agreements. And, you know, sometimes right now in this pandemic, it comes down to like, okay, you talk to your head rep about that, we're going with that answer so we can have the same thing in the contract. Trying to give you some, you know, reasonableness test for some of this stuff. And, you know, their FAQ site not, you know, is down. It's just like contact your head rep. So we're getting all sorts of different answers.
We're getting a new HUD rep today.
Oh,
We are too.
yeah, we've had 5 different
It's our
ones.
4th or 5th since the pandemic began.
Oh,
And I'll say from the foundation's perspective, like we had a funding cycle that ended last year where we've seen a steady increase in the number of applicants, and it's the first time we've seen a decrease in the number of applicants. And it's for us a funding cycle that will almost fund proposals off of an LOI. Like that, and so it's not overly difficult. And I think part of what we're wondering, no confirmation of it, is if organizations, it's staffing changes of their own. It's, you know, organizations have people that wear multiple hats, and so that person just can't wear one more hat right now to apply for something. And so I think we're gonna see continued strain within just nonprofit organizations in general when it comes to applying for funding, but then that also we're seeing it on the service side. People are leaving, they're leaving for other jobs, better employment, better benefits. And so I think we have to continue to keep an eye on that and know that things are difficult for providers as well, just in general.
Mr. Chair, I suggest that we move this next item, benchmark discussions. Is that something that?
I think we need to move that to the following meeting, but I wanted to put it on everyone's agenda and your thoughts. At the last COC board meeting, the updated system performance benchmarks were approved. One of them for the system really was about having a 30% decrease in the number of people who enter our emergency shelter, supportive housing, transitional housing with no prior enrollments in HMIS. So really trying to decrease the number of people who are entering our system. And we have, I think, over the last year or two, almost two, seen that decrease happen. And the discussion started at the COC board meeting about some of the rationale for our success in that has been the amount of funding that has been invested in prevention programming and then also, to an extent diversion as well. And so it was asked that the Funders Council take up a discussion about how we continue to support that type of programming, knowing that we now have a system benchmark that we're looking at, trying to decrease the number of people who are entering the system. And so I think just put that on everybody's radar, but I think we needed to have a discussion in the next meeting about that, especially with the ending of some programs. This kind of aligns nicely with ending of certain programs and starting up of others. But if we're going to meet that, continue to meet or exceed that benchmark, it's going to take continued investment in those programs and services that are preventing people from approaching our system in the first place.
Question.
Yes.
Or if we're moving into the next one, I know we broached this in the last meeting, is it possible to get that historical data with kind of the funding levels that were happening or at those times so that we could see? Or is that too complex?
Might be challenging, but we'll see what we can.
Just because I think that's what we're talking about, right?
Right.
There was X number of dollars infused in the community, and when that happened, our numbers looked like this, and then the project fell off and we saw a spike.
And I think the closest we could get to that is the chart that we saw, and it was flashed up a bit here too, about the number of enrollments dropping and the number of people who are involved in other, like prevention efforts.
So let me ask funders this question. Your consolidated plan allocation, has that changed significantly in the last couple of years?
It actually went down this past year. We haven't got our new one for next year, but it was dropped.
I mean, so we may be able to get some numbers on consolidated plan amounts and then layer the COVID dollars over it.
I don't want to create a sign. The need has changed too, though, and there's so many other factors, or like you said, the child tax credit, the monthly payments, and so forth. So, I'm just thinking, kind of to that aspect, though, the main rehab facility, I think in North Clearwater or Tarpon, maybe the XL, something like that. I think the grant ended, and that's where our street outreach brought people that were, severely had, severe substance abuse issues that were ready to get help, and now they don't have that up there. So, like a closure or ending of that kind of grant might be a more measurable. How's that impacting acuity levels or what,
I mean, I think minimally what we Doug pointed that chart of what do we know that's ending soon that we need to be planning for, because the significant increase in services is so different over the last 2 years than it has been in previous years.
All right. You want to do just briefly about one-time count?
I just want to thank everybody. I know lots of funders had people out yesterday. We also had board members out. ARRO's team served as a deployment center. So I just want to thank everybody. We're still waiting on final numbers. We know at least more than 1,000 surveys were completed. We still have a few paper surveys to input, but not a ton. And I heard right before this meeting started that Brian said there are way less duplicates than there's been in the past. And so we're really excited to, share that whenever it's available, but I wanted to thank everybody for participating.
Your staff was all amazing.
There were a lot of volunteers out there, I have to say. I didn't think we could do it with an outbreak, and everybody came together, so thank you.
All right, then we'll leave it at that.
Duggan, I want to just check in that our currently scheduled time, that's my alarm to call Joe. That our currently scheduled time is going to make sense for the things y'all want to accomplish. Your next meeting is March 25th, which is, a little while from now. Fine for that to stay the same. The alternatives would be to do one on February 25th. Or March 18th, which isn't that much sooner. So just want to check in on timeline.
I think the big thing that we always need kind of this time of year is funders, as we're doing our action plans, is if there's any changes in priorities from the COC that we need to consider for funding allocations. So,
I'm fine with leaving it how it is. I just wanted to check in based on what y'all needed.
I was also curious, or maybe an upcoming meeting, with the Built for Zero thing. We haven't heard much of that yet, but seeing how there's always this energy off of Pitt where people are like, we need to do more, we've got to get out. We have that energy. If we took, that and said, our goal is to house 100 individuals, street homeless individuals this month, or what, or, in the next 90 days, whatever. I feel like we've got that energy there that we could really delve into that Built for Zero. So I don't know how far along you guys are on considering.
We're just forming our team,
Okay.
so there will be a Built for Zero update. I think the hard part is fitting it in on these tight agendas. So I think what we're looking at now is probably scheduling a special meeting that's like a Zoom only, not decision-making kind of meeting to share some of that information.
All right, then we'll March it is.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So weird. So I actually,